Hello, everyone. My name is Father Christopher Brashears, and I'm the pastor of the Panhandle out here in Oklahoma. Now, for our Lenten study, I've done this one every year, and for this year, I've chosen a book for our Lenten meditations, our Lenten study, which is The Art of Dying Well by St. Robert Bellarmine. As I came across this book recently, I found it a very beautiful and deep, rich examination of what we really ought to be doing to prepare ourselves for death, especially as that is the great transition into eternal life. So I've brought this up for our Lenten reflection, our Lenten material to study. Welcome, everybody. I know that our last video, there were some audio problems. We had one of our parishioners, thankfully, very thankful that reached out and told me about this, so that we could fix this. I had no idea that the audio didn't work on that, so we're getting it fixed on this time. Now, if you don't have the book already, you can go to our website, panhandlecatholic.org, and under the upcoming tab, there's the Lenten book study, and on there you can find a way to either purchase the book or to get it digitally for free. I'm using today a program called Verbum, and in this program, you can find on there that it's a Bible study program, but you can buy these books on here. But I'm not suggesting you all do it this way, but it's a very useful tool, and so our editions may be just a little bit different, but I think the majority of it will be the same. If you have any questions, as usual, you can send them in to Pastor plus Lent at panhandlecatholic.org, and that'll just help me to get quicker to your questions and to help kind of answer some things if there's some questions out there. All right, well, let's get right into the video today because there's a lot to cover here. Now, we start off with a preface of St. Robert Bellarmine, who was a great defender of the faith, gives really wonderful, succinct teachings. Now, the first thing to kind of focus on here is the art on which depends our highest and eternal interest. That's what this art is. The art of dying well is that which depends our highest and eternal interest. Now, what St. Robert Bellarmine is talking about here, as far as art goes, is not the idea of what we kind of think of art. We tend to think of art as being paintings, maybe sculpture, but we don't think of art as being in the original sense of manufacturing or of creating. This idea of applying a trade, a skill, for the dedication of something and to come out very beautifully. It's not just kind of the indiscriminate, but it's something that we really practice at. We hone a skill to create a beautiful work of art. And so, in that, this kind of art of dying well, we are supposed to craft it. We are supposed to work at it, supposed to practice it well. And it says this one is higher than all of the others because this one is, and he goes on the next paragraph at the very beginning, is the most important of all sciences. And the reason is because this one has to deal with our eternal good, our eternal interests, our highest goods. So, in that, there isn't something better we could apply our time to focus on rather than this. So, here at the top, we continued on. When unprepared, oppressed by disease, and scarcely possessed of reason, to give an account of those things on which, when in health, he had perhaps never once reflected. This is the reason why miserable mortals rush in crowds to hell. And as St. Peter saith, if the just man shall scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? Kind of very potent here, a very powerful statement there. But St. Robert Bellarmine is sitting here saying, when we are unprepared, oppressed by disease. Now, that oppressed by disease here, he's speaking in a theological sense. He's speaking of that disease, of the disease of sin. When we're really kind of oppressed by sin and when we're kind of just engrossed in the sin and we're unprepared, we're scarcely possessed of reason, then, yeah, how do we even give those things which maybe we haven't even reflected on in health? So he says, while we have the time now, while we have health now, while we have opportunity to be released from the oppression of this disease of sin, let us then meditate upon these things. Let us reflect on these things and then be able to give a good account to the judge when we come to the end, because all of us will stand before the judge and it will be decided whether we go to hell, whether we go to heaven. Uh, and so St. Peter, he goes on, he says, no, if the just man shall scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? and only but the grace of God can we do these things. But we must have a conversion. So he speaks about this a little later on. But miserable mortals rush in crowds to hell. We mustn't forget hell's a real thing, and it's not just a real thing; it's also something which is quite um, pervasive in the sense that there will be many that go to hell, and we can't just sit there and say, oh well, but the mercy of God, right? But the mercy of God requires that we participate, that we do something for our own salvation. You can't just say, well, God will take care of it. God will just do it. God will just give me good things. Yes, but he calls for us to have a participation in our own salvation. Moving on. Now, if death be considered absolute in itself, without a doubt it can be called an evil, because that which is opposed to life, we must admit cannot be good. And death is opposed to life. We know this. We can, and he goes on and he kind of fleshes this out a little bit more. But death in itself is an evil. Now, it was something that God did not desire, did not wish. It was the consequence of sin. But in this, God can still do great things with it. David exclaims, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints." This is something he'll flesh out a little bit further on. But in this, we can see that the Lord right there has a real interest in us or in his saints. That it's precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Why? Because his saints then can come to be with him through that grace won by the cross and the sacrifice of his son. Another reason which proves that death, although an evil in itself, can, by the grace of God, produce many blessings. That death puts an end to the numerous miseries of this life. So while we're here in this world, while we're here in this life, we can suffer a lot. We suffer most often because of either our own personal sin or because of the sin of others that we feel the effects of. This is why there's a universal damage of sin. That when somebody sins, even if they say, well, I'm not hurting anyone, sure, there is a universal effect that happens to someone. They say, oh, I'm only hurting myself. It's hardly ever true. In fact, I can't imagine a single time when that's exclusively true. So, in that, death at least puts an end to the numerous miseries of this life. Some people say they want to live forever, they want to be immortal. But the problem with that is that they would be immortal here. There is a great desire in us, and in fact, a natural desire that we ought to have life eternal, but with God in His kingdom, not here on earth, because there's lots of suffering here an effect of sin. In freeing us from the miseries of this life, but it also hath a still more excellent advantage, because it may become the gate from a prison to a kingdom. And here, this is just a beautiful, profound image that St. Robert Bellarmine gives to us, that here we are kind of imprisoned in a sense. He goes on, the truly blessed is the death of his saints, which we read before, which by the command of our heavenly King frees the soul from the prison of the flesh and conducts her, meaning her soul, to a celestial kingdom. Let me explain real quick. I need to back up because in English we have this difficulty, especially modern day. We get very hung up on pronouns. So St. Robert Bellarmine is not a misogynist. He doesn't write in a sense of, he says a lot of times he. Well, in that, he's using what comes from Latin as an impure gender, in the sense that the he, the masculine, is almost always considered as an impure, meaning that it can refer not just to the masculine but also to the feminine. So whereas modern day English tries to remedy this by saying he or her, or he or she, or him or her, then we're trying to do this thing of having this impure but also having two pure genders. The only pure gender term is the feminine. It can only mean feminine. But in the usage, especially when we start talking about translations, it's coming out of this idea of the impure masculine usage of the pronoun. So when it says he, you should never think exclusively he unless the context gives it to us that way. Every time you see he, it's he or she. But that should just be our mentality. It's, again, this is the way the writing, this is very much the understanding of proper cases and proper genders. Now, when it gets down to and conducts her, to a celestial kingdom. He didn't all of a sudden switch and say, "Oh, now he's talking about women, and women go to the celestial kingdom and men don't." No, this is false grammar. This is very poor understanding. Instead, he goes back to the Latin, whereas a lot of other languages have masculine and feminine nouns. So he's just referring back here to the feminine, meaning the soul. So if the king, heavenly king, frees the soul from the prison of the flesh and conducts her, meaning conducts the soul, to a celestial kingdom. So in here, there may be some confusion with that, but let me just kind of clear that up real quick. Now, getting back to it, truly blessed is the death of the saints. And this idea of freeing the soul from the prison of the flesh conducts her to a celestial kingdom. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful imagery in the sense that we are, and we'll see this later on. St. Robert Bellarmine talks about this as, we need to remember that we are foreigners in this place. This is not our homeland. We are not citizens of the world. We are citizens of the eternal kingdom. And we are only kind of passing through. We are only these voyagers going through this area, this kingdom of the earth, to get to our true kingdom where we belong. And so, as this is happening, we see that within this, there's kind of we're prisoners in a sense. We're prisoners in this foreign place. We are trapped here for the time being, and the only passage out from this kingdom to the next kingdom is the passageway of death. Now, before Jesus Christ, that passageway was a deep chasm, and there was just a falling down into the deep chasm. But Jesus Christ, with the cross, now creates a bridge for us, and that we can walk across that. That through Jesus Christ, through that sacrifice of the cross, we can now come safely to the other side, which is the celestial kingdom. We can. That doesn't say that we will. There's still that much depends upon our own choice and our own cooperation with the grace of God. Continuing, the souls in purgatory also. Death brings no slight benefit. It brings a great benefit, for it delivers them from the fear of death and makes them certain of possessing one day eternal happiness. Now, when we talk about purgatory, certainly Protestants have very bad ideas about it, if they have any idea of it at all. And Catholics also normally have a pretty poor understanding of purgatory. I've heard lots of things where people say, "Oh, well, purgatory. I go there if it's like limbo. If it really hasn't been decided where I go yet." No, that's not true. When we stand before the judge, we will either go to the left, which Jesus refers to as a side with the goats, as to those that are off to eternal damnation, or we'll go to the right with the sheep, and we'll be separated in this way. If we go to the right with the sheep, then we are already destined for heaven. Your sentence is heaven, but it may say you're not quite ready for that yet. Purgatory then is this place where these remaining distractions, these remaining things, these temporal punishments of sin, these consequences of our actions may be purified out of us because we're not yet perfect. And so as the Lord is trying to perfect us with his grace, this place of purgatory is where we can, if we are properly unprepared for death, then it is a final purgation, this final removal of all of those obstacles within us that keep us from loving God. And because in heaven, nothing impure will enter there. So we need to be purged of anything that is impure, imperfect within us, so that we might enter into the heavenly kingdom. Now, so for that reason, it says it's no slight benefit. It's a great benefit, in fact, because it delivers them from fear. If we are in purgatory, we then have no fear. And so we have this great expectation. Once we get there, we say there's no fear of death and there's no fear of damnation, which is maybe a better translation there of the fear of death. The fear of damnation, we no longer have that fear once we're in purgatory, and death brings it to at that point, and makes us certain of possessing one day eternal happiness. We don't know how long purgatory will take, but it doesn't matter because we need to be made perfect in his love. It goes on to say that it also prevents death, prevents the measure of their punishment from increasing. So in this, in our life, not only did it talk about the ending of our sufferings or the miseries that may come. But it also now it says that the measure of their punishments is stopped from increasing with death. So if we die, then we're no longer able to commit sins, at least if we're destined for heaven. If we're destined for hell, then it doesn't matter how much more we sin, our fate is sealed. But in that, we can no longer receive more punishment um, by death. It will be either damnation or it will be salvation. But once death comes about, there's no more increase of that. We can't accrue any more sinfulness to ourselves, any more sinful punishment or punishment that comes from sin. To end the chapter with, or the introduction with, death as produced by sin is an evil, but that by the grace of Christ, who condescended to suffer death for us, it hath become in many ways salutary, helpful, healthy for our soul, lovely, even to be desired. So it's salutary in the sense that, it helps our souls to in suffering to prevent us from committing any more sins, which leads to further punishment. It gives peace of mind to those who are destined for purgatory or, ultimately heaven. But it's also, in a sense, lovely to be desired. Now, this doesn't mean a suicidal kind of way. We're not supposed to like go out and commit suicide and say, "Oh, but I love death." No, but it shouldn't be something avoided either. It shouldn't be something that we see as this great thing to be avoided. This odious thing, because as he mentioned beautifully, it is this doorway, the gate, the cell door being opened out of this prison of a kingdom of the world into the kingdom of heaven. And so we must pass through it if we ever hope to get into heaven. We can never stay on this side and enter into the joy of heaven fully. So, chapter 1, he who desires to die well must live well. This is kind of the quintessential takeaway point. It's wonderful how he sums things up in very succinct ways. So he describes two different parts here. He'll first speak of the precepts we must follow while in good health, and the other of those we should observe when we're dangerously ill or near death's door. So in good health, he doesn't just mean health of body, but also health of mind, health of soul. So in this, we need to be sure that we have understood. We're talking about this first part right now. Then we're also going to talk about those when we get a little closer to the dangerous ills of the body, or near death's door. So the precept, he says, the general rule that he who lives well will die well. Now, he's speaking here much more philosophically. He's taking kind of the philosophy of the day. This is a principle: he who lives well will die well. Good. But in that, we need to understand that he's now speaking kind of more directly to the people of the day and to the philosophy of the day, trying to help draw them into something deeper, out of just the philosophy of the day into something more profound. Death is nothing more than the end of life. Now, right above, we just had a whole introduction how death was certainly not just the end of life, and that the Lord uses it in much better ways. But in this, he's again gone back to that philosophical kind of notion where he's just saying, what is death? Death is nothing more than the end of life. Great. But he's just succinctly drawing this out so we can talk about this philosophical principle. He who hath never led a good life cannot die a good death. So this is one of those things, kind of a principle, a philosophical proof here. If you don't lead a good life, you cannot die a good death. You can't be completely evil and then all of a sudden have a perfect death, a good death. So what he's saying here is you have to continue to live a good life in order to have a good death. And this next line is just beautiful, and I'll take a minute and reflect a little more on it. All that walk along the right path are sure to arrive at the place of their destination, whilst, on the contrary, they who wander from it will never arrive at their journey's end. Now, I said I want to kind of talk about this for a second. Behind me, this image that I've used is a beautiful pathway through the mountains, kind of covering it up with my head right there. But in this, we can kind of think of very practical solutions. So, for instance, here in Guyman, if we want to go to Amarillo, we have to go directly south. And there's a highway that goes south out of Guyman. Now, if we stay on that highway, we are guaranteed that in about 2 hours driving the speed limit, we will arrive at Amarillo. Great, perfect. But if along the way we say, oh, you know what? I like this road over here. This road looks more friendly to me, or it seems like it'll be a more fun ride. Well, okay, but that one goes straight east. Well, if we go straight east for an hour, now we're going to have to cut back down and back. And generally out here in the panhandle, we have cubic kind of lines of our highways. So you're going to have to go south an hour, and then we're going to have to go back west an hour. So we've already gotten off of our pathway here by deciding to take a different route. And because of that, we have to cross back and make that distance. If we think of it in kind of broader sense, if we think of in a desert, if somebody says that we're standing at one end of the desert and the person says, listen, where you need to go, here's a compass, just follow straight north. And if you go straight north, you keep on that needle and you keep going straight north, that in 2 days' time, you'll hit this beautiful oasis. So take your provisions, prep well, walk at a constant speed, and when you get there, it'll just be directly due north. Don't waver from the path. Okay, we set out. We take our canteens. We take all of our preparations. We go one day, 2 days straight north, following that compass, never wavering from the arrow, and we'll get there. Great. Now, what would happen if we take, instead of just going straight north, we look at that little that needle there, and we say, okay, but I'll just go 1 degree off to the left. How bad could that be? How awful could it be? Right? So maybe after 10 minutes, it's not that bad. In fact, if we did that 1 degree, then we're not that far off of our path. In fact, if we then readjusted our compass after 10 minutes and we went straight north from there, then we would probably just be 10 minutes, or not really, do the math there. It's a little bit, I have to pull out the quadratic equation. Not ready to do that on this stream. So we'd be just a little bit off, right? Because we've taken just that 1 degree off there. And so now we've created a little separation of us, just 10 minutes. So if we went straight north from that point forward, hey, we'd be all right. We'd just be a little bit to the side of the city. We'd still see it. We could still make that course correction. Now, if instead of just going for 10 minutes off of, 1 degree off, we instead take that 1 degree to the left and we say, but I'm going to walk this path, but I'm going to go 1 degree off in this direction too. So we're trying to follow along there. And what if we went for the whole 2 days in that 1 degree of separation off? By then, we'd be very far from that. We wouldn't make it to that city. We would make it somewhere, far to the west of that city. So the point of it is that each of these mortal sins that we may have, if we engage them, if we tolerate them in the sense that we allow them to continue in our lives, we don't try to do anything with them, that's like a single degree of separation from the path, the straight path that leads us to that city, leads us through that desert to the beautiful city. So if we're off, even by 1 degree, over time, I said 2 days in this example. What if it's 2 weeks? What if it's 10 years? What if it's 40 years of our lives that we have accepted this mortal sin and we have not course corrected, but we have simply said, oh, we'll go off in this direction. Even if we were to stop doing it, like that example of saying after the 10 minutes, we then look at our compass and say, okay, but here's the straight way north. But we've never repented. We've never course corrected backwards. Well, after 2 days, 10 years, 40 years of never repenting, of never drawing back to that right path, that straight path, then we're going to be very, very far from that. And if we never course correct, we never repent, if we never turn back to the right, then what we're going to find is we're going to be way off in the middle of the desert. And that's the point, is that this straight path leads us, go straight here. And if we get off, we have to go back. At some point, we always have to go back. And the longer that we allow these things to persist in our life, and so that 1 degree is for, just imagine, one mortal sin that we tolerate in our lives. We say, oh, well, I'm sure, Lord, but you have to accept that I'm just weak and I don't have any control over these things. And so I'm just going to keep going to church, but I'm also going to keep with this mortal sin. We can't do that. If we also then keep onto those things and hold to those things, more things and more things and more things, it's another degree, another degree, another degree, another degree. Um, then we are so far away. If we get to up to 180, we are walking in the opposite direction of Jesus Christ. And of course, that's the ultimate limit right there. Um, is that we would get so far away. So, in that, we need to consider in our own lives, what are those things that are separating us, drawing us off from that straight path that we never arrive at the journey's end. He goes on to say, those also who diligently apply to study will soon become learned doctors. They who do not will become ignorant. And this is something which I really was beautiful to me, stood out to me, that we're called to constant study. We're called to come to know the Lord more, to come to enter in more deeply. And you all are doing that here. And that's wonderful. Because sooner or later, you'll become learned doctors. You keep applying, you keep practicing, you keep engaging, you keep learning, you will become the learned doctor. It may take some people, you know, 5 years to get their doctorate. Takes some people 10 years or 20 years to get their doctorate. They keep applying themselves, especially diligently applying themselves. They will become doctors, and sooner rather than later. Those who do not will just be ignorant. Those who say, you know what, I don't need to know anymore. Okay, then you won't know anymore. But for those who want to come to learn, to become more learned and then become more deep in your relationship with God and in your knowledge of God, beautiful thing. So he says, he goes on, kind of like a professor would, but perhaps some one of you may mention as an objection the example of the good thief. And then he goes on to give this beautiful explanation about how the good thief did not live just a horrible life. He led a good life, but he did not. He had a fall. But we have that. We have sin. We have even the good and the holy. As the psalmist says, even the just man falls many times a day. We have sinned, and we recognize that. But that's not the point, right? It's reconciling, being penitent for your things, contrite of heart for your sins. So the good thief could not have led an evil life, and therefore had come to an evil and then come to a good end. Instead, he had to have lived a good life to come to a good end. And he goes on and he talk about all of these different situations with it. We see him defending Christ. We see him confessing to Christ. We see even him trying to get his the other thief to convert with him. This this is beautiful. It says that he admonished his blaspheming companion. He admonished him. That's a good thing. Now, not in our maybe common usage of it, to admonish, but this is one of those great acts of charity that we can do for a person, is to animate them towards the good, to draw them into the good, draw them away from the evil. But so he tried to do all of these things, and because of that, we see the fruits of his life. We see that he had led a good life because he was doing all these good things, even at the end. They weren't foreign to him. They weren't unnatural to him. In fact, they were the most natural thing for him. What was unnatural for him was the crime. And because of that, he repented and he drew back close to the Lord. The Lord then fulfilled on his promise. In the chapter, it's just a summary kind of thing. This great truth now remains established, that a good death depends upon a good life. So start now, to better your life right now. Chapter 2, the second precept, which is to die to the world. All they who live to the world are dead to God. That is a gut punch if I ever heard one. All they who live to the world are dead to God. This is a powerful statement, but he goes on and he gives good. He's not just saying these things out there, and he's not giving his new teaching. He's sitting there and he's saying, "Listen, I will line it all out for you." And so he does. He gives all of these different parts of Scripture, and it's beautiful. It's rich. But I highlighted here then that Christ tells us clearly, or clearly tells us, that by the world, those who are meant, who with the prince of their prince, the devil, shall hear at the last day, go ye cursed into eternal or everlasting fire. So here Christ says, those of the world are those who are going, you ye accursed, those who have their prince as the devil. We can have our prince as Jesus Christ, or we can have our prince as the devil. Um, but they will go into the everlasting fire. Now, this is kind of important to also reflect upon for a second, that there is hell. Jesus Christ says it over and over and over again. There is hell. There is damnation. Don't think that you're going to get, an easy pass here. Don't think, and maybe he might come back and say, even to the Protestants, don't think like the Protestants do, who think that you will just easily get saved. As he mentions in another place, he says, there will come those who will knock at my door and say, Lord, Lord, and I will say, depart from me. For even though you know my name, I do not know you. You are a stranger to me. You are foreign to me. You belong, in a sense, to the prince of the world, the devil, and you do not belong to me. You are not the sheep who hear my voice. You are not those who come to me when I call. You come to me when it's convenient for you. You are the ones who just take my name, in a sense, in the most vain possible way, because they're just merely calling upon it for their own neck. And they're not saying, didn't want to have a relationship with God. They didn't want to be close to him in their life. Whoever, therefore, will be a friend of the world becometh an enemy to God. And that is just right there in the book of James. So powerful. You want to become an enemy of God? Be a friend of the world and live according to the world and direct your life according to that. So we go on. If we wish to learn the art of dying, well, it is our bound and serious duty to go forth from the world, not in word and in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Oh, we'll stop here for just a second, because this is absolutely what has to happen. We have to do things in deed and truth. We must separate ourselves in deed and in truth, not just by word or what we say to people. Oh, yes, the world is so awful, and look how it's gone so crazy. But if we don't separate ourselves from that, then we haven't done anything truly. We haven't acted. We haven't brought that out. This is where there's sometimes a conflict, especially with Protestants, that talk about this. Are you saved by your deeds? No, Catholics don't believe that. We do not believe we are saved by our deeds. We can't earn salvation. However, we must participate with salvation. Salvation is not forced on us, we're not dragged along like a puppy on a leash who doesn't want to walk. That's not how God treats us. We must participate with his grace, and in participating with his grace, then those effects of salvation take effect within our souls. We have to open up the door to Christ. He knocks, but we have to open up the door to him. This kind of cooperation then is a true relationship. It's not just a God forcing on us salvation that we barely want, or that we say, once upon a time that we want. And so he says, Jesus reminds us that you will judge the fruit by the tree by its fruits. You will judge the tree by its fruits. And so because of that, we must have good fruits, meaning that we must have good production of what is happening truly within our hearts. And we can't just speak out with our mouth, our tongue. We can't just proclaim these things with our words, but we must proclaim them in truth, indeed, how we live in our lives. They must have true effect. And then for our Lord being asked, are they few that are saved? He replied, strive to enter by the narrow gate. See what he does here in the gospel. He doesn't sit here and say, yeah, there's only a few. Or, oh yeah, there's a lot. No, basically everybody. Anybody who's baptized in my name, they're definitely getting in. What does he say? He says, strive to enter by the narrow gate. He responds to their question not by answering it directly, but he says instead almost this exhortation. And the way I hear it is the way that he spoke to the rich man. The rich man who came to him and said, I've done all this, I've done all this. And Jesus, the gospel says, he looked at him with love. And he said, go, sell everything and follow me. Because Jesus knew he had attachment to the world. He lived in the world. He belonged to the world, even though that he had done all of these other things. He fulfilled these precepts, but his heart wasn't there. He said, be detached from your money and just come follow me. So Jesus responds to him with a command, with an action, with a deed. You know, are they few that are saved? Strive. He tells them to do something. So are we saved by our acts? No, but we are saved with our acts. It is that cooperation with God's grace. Strive to enter by the narrow gate. And so he says, work towards that. And what's the narrow gate? That gate you can't pass through if you're carrying a lot of luggage, a lot of baggage on you. You have to be stripped down. You have to be not attached to all these things of the world. So the Lord is calling on us. And he says, you know what? I need to encourage you in this moment. It's kind of this way of saying, you know what? Really, there's not going to be a lot. You should strive to enter by the narrow. So then he goes on in the Gospel of Matthew, and he says, how narrow is the gate, and straight is the way that leadeth to life, and few there are that find it. Few are the way that find it, or are those that find it. This is really challenging to us, that we should not assume our own salvation. We should not assume that because we are coming to church, I even don't presume my own salvation. In fact, there are some responsibilities as a priest, as a pastor, as a judge in the tribunal that now make my life, even my salvation, even more in danger because of this kind of added responsibility. To those who are trustworthy in small things can be trustworthy in big things, but they are bigger things. So now the risk of my salvation even becomes more questionable. I've been listening to Therese of Lisieux, The Story of the Soul, in which she herself even talks about this concern and this danger. And you say, well, a nun, of course, is going to heaven. No. Dante's Inferno remarked that at the very lowest levels of hell were numerous bishops, even popes, even in there to have the priests and the nuns and the religious. And their point is that because it is almost more damning in these certain senses to have those greater responsibilities and to fall from them. So none of us should assume that we are just getting this ticket to heaven, that it's just going to be so easy. In fact, we need to strive. We need to really engage and strive to enter by the narrow gate. And finding it, we must follow it and diligently, just like going back to the compass. Get 1 degree off, the longer you're on that route, is the more dangerous it becomes. So with this, I guess I should leave this passage up real quick. So St. Paul goes on and he starts talking about how we ought to live. And he speaks to us and he says these things, that, if those who have wives act as if you don't have wives. Well, this doesn't mean that you go out and sleep around. Certainly not. He himself condemns adultery and all these things. So we're not talking about just kind of living freely. What he's meaning is that we must live in context. He says, he goes on to say that those who weep for the loss of children or their goods, they should weep but a little. If they rejoice at having success or worldly honors, or they gain property or houses, they should really not celebrate too much. And again, this kind of notion, it needs to be contextual. That's what the Apostle Paul is telling us. We should not live in the context of heaven or of the earth, but of the context of heaven. While the earth says, "Oh, those are amazing honors," we can look around and we can say, "Oh, he got so many beautiful honors, and he's done all these things, and he's well honored on earth." It means nothing to God. It doesn't. There's no honors on earth that we can give up to God and say, "Oh, look, God, I have these honors. I have these things. You should let me in." No, just being a good person doesn't give us the entrance in heaven. St. Paul says, wives as if you didn't, if you have wives as if you didn't have them, in the sense that in heaven, we hear Jesus remind us that in heaven we're not given or taken in marriage. There's no longer this sacrament of marriage there, in that sense of procreation or the longevity or the helps and the aids to draw the people into holiness. Because in heaven, those things are superfluous. Now they have been superseded by something even greater, a greater unity, a greater relationship. So all of those things, as children, the loss of children, you should weep just a little bit. Why? Because if we have founded hope, if we have done what we've properly done, then we should at least have a conviction, a solid and affirmed faith in the promises of Jesus Christ if we've lived up to our end of them. So he speaks contextually, and this is what I kind of want to relate a little bit more on. Um, so all things need to be viewed in the context of heaven. This is why the art of dying well has us reflect on these things. I'll just recall to your minds the movie A Christmas Story, and where the kid wanted the BB gun, and everybody told him, you'll shoot your eye out, you'll shoot your eye out. Well, in that, and of course, spoilers, I guess if you haven't seen the movie, it's been a while, but in the end, he does. He shoots his BB gun, and the icicle falls and cuts his eye, and he thinks he shot his eye out, and mom freaks out. But in this, sometimes that's really the case, right? That we want something so badly, but we ignore or we don't even realize the dangers that comes with it. So God may often keep us from having those good things that we want because we say, "But God, look how good it is. Good, it's perfect for me to have this. It's just, it's right." And I'll give the example of maybe a better job. You're applying for a better job. You want to work at this place, and you say, "This would be perfect. This would be amazing. This would be remarkable. I'm going to go get that job." And you apply for it, and you don't get it. And you say, "But God, I prayed. I asked for you. It's really good. It's be good for our family. It's good for our finances. Lord, it allows me to give you a greater 10% of my income. This would be like twice as much as I was giving even before." But Lord, why would you not want these good things, all of these good things? What the Lord may know is that at that workplace, there's somebody there, a man or woman, that is a temptation towards adultery for you, and knows that you will be overwhelmed by this, and that would lead to other sins and other things that you're not prepared for, and it would lead you down a road of damnation. So if He prevented that, then it's for your good that you weren't veering off that path of temptation into hell. And so a lot of times we look at these things and we say, "But God, I don't understand. The way that I see it, my context is it's perfect." We don't have that bigger picture. We can't see everything. And so we ought to be very thankful, especially for the prayers that God doesn't answer. Why doesn't He answer it? Even if we don't understand it, maybe it's for good. I'll give you another couple of examples to illustrate a point on another contextual issue. Almost 9 million Americans tuned in to the premiere of Fear Factor when it first premiered, where the winner of the three stunts won $50,000. The stunts were included being dragged by a horse, being put in a coffin and covered with rats, and climbing around on a suspended car that's suspended way above the ground. Surely they absolutely had harnesses on, but they did all these crazy things just to get $50,000. They're willing to sacrifice so much, to endure so much, to suffer so much, just to get $50,000, of which then they had to pay a lot of fees and taxes and all that thing. But in another example, there are some medical procedures out there that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're incredibly painful, and they may extend life only for a few weeks or a few months. And yet people are willing to engage in this and say, just for a few more weeks, a few more months, maybe even another year of life, we can prolong this, we can do this. And they're willing to make these great sacrifices, these great strides, suffer these great pains just for a little longer. Well, then, what is asked of us for the infinitely greater and more worthy gift of eternal life? What is it? What is that kind of buy-in? What's that paying? And Jesus reminds us in the Gospel of John, "You are my friends if you do what I command." And what is that? What is that He commands us? That you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, "Do this, and you will live." So in this, we kind of get very caught up a lot of times in the wrong context. We say, "Oh, for $50,000, I'll go and do all these crazy things," or "I'm willing to pay and I'm willing to go through all this suffering just for a few more weeks of life." But what will we do for eternal life? That greater and more perfect joy, that perfect prize. So really, it should cause us to question: does the Lord really ask of us in exchange for the goods, those eternal goods? Again, going right back to the introduction, the art of dying well has to do with our highest and eternal good. So, getting back into the document, dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims to refrain yourselves from carnal desires which war against the soul. This is, St. Peter in his epistle. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims. You don't belong to this world. You're strangers here. You're pilgrims in this place. You are not citizens here. Refrain from carnal desires which war against the soul. Carnal desires aren't just, we think oftentimes of lust. Those aren't the carnal desires in that sense. I mean, it's very restrictive. Carnal desires are those things of the flesh, those desires of the flesh which wage war against the soul. Why? Because they're not the same desires of the soul. The desire of the soul has to be for God, for heavenly things, for those more perfect things. But the body says, no, I really want something. I want something now. I want you to feed me. We just had yesterday, Ash Wednesday, with our fasting and our abstinence. So beautiful in that practice of doing that. And the body says, no, give me food, give me meat. And it says it's warring against the soul because the soul does these things that we might have a greater attachment to God and a detachment from the. Moving on down a little bit further, the good things of this life, therefore its riches, honors, and pleasures are not entirely forbidden to Christians, but only an immoderate love of them. So it's not that there are bad things of wealth, money, honors, pleasures, depending what pleasures, right? They're not sinful pleasures, but they're not entirely forbidden from Christians. But the problem is when we have immoderate love of them, when we have an immoderate love of riches. The person who, the rich person who continues to want money, and just in the story in the gospel, the rich man Jesus loved looked at him lovingly. There, the riches. He could not let go of the riches. He had an immoderate love of them. And so these are the things which bring about damnation when we make idols out of these things. Again, what are we going to present to God? It's not so much that the person is rich, but then you ask the question, what did you do with the riches? How did you invest them? Were they for the good of people? Did they raise people up? Did they help people to draw closer to God? Were these honors? Were these pleasures? Were these things also for heavenly purposes? Or were they just simply for he says, their concupiscence of the flesh? So, not the abundance of riches, nor kingdoms, nor honors make us to be of the world, but the concupiscence of the flesh, the concupiscence of the eyes, and the pride of life, which in one word is called cupidity, and is opposite to divine charity. We cannot have divine charity if we are angling after all of those things to fulfill the flesh or to fulfill the eyes or to fulfill this pride of life, that I need to leave my mark. Will the world remember me? All these things. So all those things are opposed to divine charity. All carnal pleasures become insipid when once we taste the divine sweetness. This is a beautiful statement. When we taste of those higher things, those greater things, then carnal objects become less important. This is one reason why the religious do oftentimes have an easier time with it. They've tasted that divine sweetness. Some of us haven't tasted that in the sense of, maybe we've gone throughout our life, we've just been very diligent in coming to church, but we've sat in church, for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years of our lives, and we sit there and we say, ugh, I don't even know why I do it. I guess I just do it out of habit. Then we really haven't tasted yet the divine sweetness. And if you have trouble with that, let's work on that. That's something we need to very much work on. But then everything else just kind of becomes tasteless. The last sum up statement: not possibly live to the world and to God. Anyone, cannot enjoy heaven. And those final lines there, summing everything up, just gives a whole context for. We can't have both. We can't hold in both of our hands. We can't hold in our left hand the world and then the right hand God. We can't live for God and live for the world. We will do one or the other, and we will hate the other one. So the other one becomes odious to us. If we are very worldly, then godly things become odious to us. If we live godly things, then the world becomes odious. And we are just passing through. So really kind of what kingdom you belong to. And really kind of ask, what is it that in your life right now is an obstacle to divine charity? What is it that is opposed to in your life of this greatness of charity. So, till next week, God with you. Have a blessed Lent.